Good morning, good afternoon, and whatever time zone you're in, welcome. I'm Bob Putnam from the May Institute and the National Technical Assistance Center, and we're going to be, for the extra hour and 15 minutes, we'll be talking about improving attendance. We think this is pretty important, both in terms of improving academic performance of students. And as you know, if students aren't in school, they're not learning. And secondly, in terms of improving student wellness, their connection to school is really important. So our plan is to give you some information over the next about hour or so, and then leave 15 minutes for questions. And I have some introductory slides that the conference has asked us to review. And, you know, since this is a PBS event, we have some clear expectations around being responsible, be safe, be respectful, and we would say be nice. We love you to questions in the poll, and we have an awesome content facilitator who will tee those questions up for us either during the presentation or during the last 15 minutes. And so since you're already here, you know how to access your agenda. Just go down and click My Agenda for other sessions that are available to you. And you can join a session, interact through chat, polls, and files. The polls are the questions that we'll be trying to answer for you. And you can use the chat for engaging with other participants around the session. But if you want to look at in terms of specific questions for us, you need to put them in the question and answer. And Joyce West, who's our content facilitator, will be prioritizing those questions. So if you navigate away, there's a way to come back. You would just go back to where you are, click on My Agenda, and then you will go back into click on our session, and you go back into the session. And if anytime you need help, there's a help desk on Pathable that can help you with whatever technical support you need. They're awesome people, and they're really ready and able to help you if you need additional help. And many of you are with a team, either on your district level or at your school level, or in some cases at your federal level. And we want you to consider 5 questions. You know, how does this compare to our priorities? What team would oversee this work? And we think it should be your PBS team, because on a number of schools we work with, they silo their attendance team. We think it really should be integrated. It's much more effective. What other things should we do to so we can move on to this work, and how will we assess whether it's being implemented well and working? And we're going to talk about that in terms of our presentation. So I said, I'm Bob Putnam from the May Institute and the National Technical Assistance Center for PBS. We also have Superintendent Mark Pellegrino, who leads the effort in terms of his district around improving attendance, and they really have gotten some really nice outcomes. Amber Casavant is the district-wide PBS coordinator, MTSS coordinator, and is also a lead BCBA for the Gardner Public Schools. And then we have Joyce West, who is our content facilitator. She's director of pupil personnel in the Gardner Public Schools. And we have an awesome technical assistance from Christine Downs. If you're interested in some other presentations, we have a couple other presentations that Gardner is involved in. One is around integrating mental health into your MTSS PBS system, as well as another in terms of improving class-wide behavior support, implementing high leverage classroom practices. And one of the things we're going to talk about in that presentation is how you scale these things up. So this is a email that went out to all the schools that from the district, and that from January to February last year, that every single school actually showed improvements in terms of their attendance. And this is some of the interventions that that they looked at in terms of doing, which is defining attendance, because it really wasn't clearly defined. They developed a data system that they could track and disaggregate their attendance, created specific problem behavior statements so they could be much more targeted in terms of their interventions, resource map their interventions. And so our goal today is I'm going to give you some beginning introductory slides, and then they're going to really describe how they've worked to improve their attendance using a three-tier model and integrating all of their staff to really focus on attendance. So just in terms of regular, if we want to operationally define this, regular attendees miss less than 5% of instructional opportunities. At risk is 5 to 9%. Chronically absent is 10 or more. Severely chronically absent is 20% or more. And we know with COVID, that attendance was exacerbated as a problem. Some kids, as mentioned before, from these superintendents that gave the opening keynote actually were involved more with school on a virtual basis. Other students really, in some ways, just disappeared off the map. So we have over 7 million students missing 15 or more days in school. This is from the Department of Education 2021. And that's 16% of the student population, or 1 in 6 students. And what we see and what Gardner tried to track is looking at absenteeism in the first month can predict poor attendance throughout the school year. You know, half of students who miss 2 to 4 days in September go on to miss nearly a month of school. Over 8 million students miss nearly a month of school. And 1 in 10 kindergarten and first grade students are chronically absent. So this is an early predictor in terms of school performance. And that just missing 10% of days negatively affects student academic performance. And students who live in communities with high level of poverty are 4 times more likely to be chronically absent than other students for oftentimes reasons beyond their control, such as unstable housing, unreliable transportation, lack of access to mental health. So this is really a holistic problem that we want to really look at in terms of what we can do to help support students and their families. And we have a big equity issue that students with special needs, racial minorities from poverty, as I just mentioned, and from single parent households have particularly greater issues with attendance. And when we look at in terms of that disaggregation by that group, we may have different interventions depending in terms of what group is represented. And poor attendance around academic performance can influence whether children read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade or be held back. And by 6th grade, it's an early predictor of whether a student will drop out of school. So we're really looking at in terms of this affects academic performance, affects students' wellness in terms of not having a good connection with school, and as an early predictor of dropouts. And when we support schools, one of the things we do, since we all know that none of us has extra time, we really want to select interventions and process that is staff time efficient and support wellness. So we really want to use that multi-tiered model. What are our tier 1 interventions that support attendance? Oftentimes the interventions tend to be reactive in terms of when students get to that kind of chronic problem. One of the things we really want to do is look at how do we identify those students early? How do we figure out ways to really develop our tier 1 interventions and our tier 2 interventions, so we're not relying on more time-intensive tier 3 interventions, right? And Rob Horner, who used to co-direct the National Technical Assistance Center, has said, do the simplest thing that result in the biggest outcome. So we really focus on that as well. And Gardner really has done some really nifty things to emphasize the simplest things that will result in the biggest improvements in terms of attendance. So these are just from a school, typical interventions, they tend to be when the student basically has started to miss school. Oftentimes they're not picked up until they end up being chronically absent. And it goes up the continuum, but these are all kind of individual interventions, and we really want to look at in terms of tier 1 being school-wide interventions and tier 2 being group-based interventions. All of these take time, oftentimes take time from the mental health folks or the school attendance folks or other folks in the school, and it may be the teachers as well. And the goal really is to look at what are the kind of preventive, proactive measures that we can do to improve attendance. And you've seen this before. It may be a little different. As Kent pointed out, we have equity in the middle. And as you saw from one of the previous slides, that equity is a real issue with attendance. We're really looking at in terms of kind of what are the systems to support the staff improving attendance. How do we have disaggregated to help us in terms of those individuals who need tier 1 interventions, tier 2 interventions, and tier 3 interventions? And then what are the evidence-based practices, right? Can we get those evidence-based practices that will be in contact with those students to prevent the problems with attendance, or on the other hand, to address those students with chronic attendance problems? So one of the things we suggest from the system level is don't silo your attendance team. And Superintendent Pellegrino made this last year a really top priority of doing this, and made this one of the top priorities of the principals, because if students are not accessing their educational opportunities, they're not going to make progress in terms of that. And secondly, really focused this within their MTS teams, looked at in terms of how they could make good database decision-making that would meet on a regular basis. Put a lot of time in terms of, and they'll talk about how they have access to representative disaggregated data at the school level, and that this was shared with the faculty. And then they worked on the development from a team-based perspective of problem statements based on the data. All right, so they disaggregated data by school-wide, class period, individual by day, by subgroups. They developed problem statements for individual planning, and really looked at how to prioritize least time and resource interventions, right? And then use the data to progress monitor and problem solve. So here's an example of a problem statement. Almost 45 students have 5 or more absence, with grade 3 having the lowest attendance percentage rate on Wednesdays during the virtual and remote learning. Right? And I won't disclose what they did in terms of that, but they actually made a significant difference in terms of improving attendance on Wednesdays. And then when you look at in terms of tier 2 is really looking at in terms of incorporating attendance into school-wide and class-wide expectations. Be there. What's your acknowledgement systems for attendance? Another significant thing is educating the families on the importance of attendance. It's just those little slides we have at the beginning, why attendance is important. And then also sharing data with families that you could have an attendance calendar that tracks, because oftentimes families don't understand or recognize how often the son or daughter may have missed school, and actually presenting a simple calendar with the amount of days there that really shows up what their attendance looks like. All right, so we talked about identifying students early in the year before it becomes a chronic problem. One of the things Gardner has done is develop standard protocols in terms of how to connect to families in a supportive way, rather than getting the phone call or the letter when they're missing. Is how do we connect those students? Because a lot of this is about connection. A lot of this is about relationships. They developed a modified check-in, check-out program, and they had small groups that identified attendance as the focus of those groups. And in tier 3 is how do we look at identifying those students? How can we do a brief functional behavioral assessment that will look at that? How do we begin to have individualized protocols focusing on the students? So the goal is not to have this. Our goal is basically look at in terms of what could we do at tier 1 and tier 2 to prevent the number of students that need to have more intensive interventions. All right, so just a context in terms of the May Institute. We've worked with Gardner for about 10 years and focused on those students who are at needed tier 3 interventions, as we're the senior doctoral BCBA. And really over the past year and a half, 2 years have really focused on their more intensive development of the MTSS systems, data and practices. And then as Dr. Pellegrino and Joyce West, they really looked at intensively focusing on attendance and incorporated the MTSS PBIS initiative. And they're a work in progress. They're looking at this as a 3 to 5 year process. So really, before I turn it over to these awesome people, Superintendent Pellegrino's email signature, positive relationships and rigor for every day in every classroom is really what we're looking for. And when you look at attendance, it's really how do you build those positive relationships to have students have a special person at school. So one of the things they've done is really how do you work on developing those positive relationships really across tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So I'm going to turn it over to Amber, right? Oh, we got way back here. All right. Amber, you all set?
Yes. So Mark is going to start us off.
Excellent. So thank you very much. Oh, geez, my camera seems to be having some problems there with technical difficulties. So Gardner Public Schools is a smaller district. It's an urban district, but it's a small urban district with about 2,300 students. We have 5 schools, and each school services grade levels. So we have one school that services pre-K through 1, one school that services grades 2 through 4, our middle school 5 through 7, and our high school 8 through 12. We do have an alternative school that services about 60 students, grades 9 through 12. And so that's a dropout prevention program. In terms of our population, we have about 22% of our students are students with disabilities. High needs population, 64.5%. Economically disadvantaged is 55%, although that's underestimated by our state's process of identifying students who come from low-income families. Our English language learners are 6%. In terms of race, our white students are about 65.7%, Hispanic 22.2%, multi-race 7.2%, African-American 2.6%, our Asian population at about 2.1%. So we're diverse, but not extremely racially diverse. But we do have a lot of students who come to us with high needs and to overcome challenges. So in terms of our theory of action, we actually put this up here. And instead of just reading this to you, I'd like you to just, I'll give you about 5 seconds to just read that theory of action. If you could go back, thank you. If you could just read that theory of action. So as we were developing as a district this theory of action at the district level cabinet, we were deciding on this really because we know that research has shown the most important person to a child's education is the teacher. The second most important person is the principal. And so we know that leadership is extremely important to every single child. And the only way that we're truly going to have adaptive changes in the schools is if we have effective principals. And my personal belief is that a principal's effectiveness is directly proportional to the principal's ability to change staff practices and rituals to align with the goals we're striving to reach. So that drove our theory of action, that we need to have systems in place. So the next slide kind of talks about why this was so important to me in terms of MTSS. You know, having been an assistant principal for 5 years and a principal for 7 years before becoming a superintendent, what I've found is that the role of principal is unmanageable. We just said we were in this big BAR grant, which is a $750,000 grant to develop a leadership pipeline. And one of the things we did was we looked at the principal job and we did surveys, not only of current sitting principals, but assistant principals. We asked people why, you know, what they think about the role of principal and whether or not they aspire to be a principal. And most people felt, and accurately so, that the role of a principal is really unmanageable. So one of the things that drove our thinking was a book. It's called, you know, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. It's how successful people become even more successful. And it's really about the fact that when you're a strong educator and you take on leadership roles, you oftentimes become an assistant principal. If you're a good assistant principal and you do good work, you're oftentimes promoted to a principal. The problem is, once you're a principal, you now need to get other people to do good work. And that's a big shift in terms of the skill set that you need to apply. So oftentimes principals have the capacity to do good work themselves, but in terms of motivating others and getting others to do good work, that's really hard to do. When you take that to the next level, which is the district level, our job is to make sure that our principals can get people to do good work. So we're training people to train people to do good work. And that's, I think, a whole other level when we're thinking of the entire system for the district. And I've always felt like the job of principal is like a whack-a-mole competition. Every year we identify different issues and targets and goals. And the principal is whacking a mole at one of those games that you might see at a town fair. And they're trying to whack the mole, and maybe they have maybe they're really good and they have 2 batons and they're trying to whack those moles back down, and you don't have enough speed to keep that going, because each year, although we might reach our goal, the next year we're going to have new goals. So the principal can't do this and continue adding goals on. There's just not enough time in the day. There's not enough time in the week, month. You don't have enough time to plan. So we're really focused on having a distributed leadership model that focused on getting the system, other people, to do good work. So when you look at the next slide, we focused a lot on leadership capacity. And the first step was we hired a district coordinator and coach, which is actually Amber Caspian, who's going to be doing the second part of this third part of this presentation. That was an important step because we needed one person dedicated to have the time to go to the MTSS social emotional learning teams and develop those teams. We did a lot of work around the 5 dysfunctions of a team, building meeting time management. But it was really important that she focused on getting these teams up and running. And one of the things that I found was we collected a lot of data on what the teams needed next. So she's been with us since January of 2019, so just before the pandemic. I'm not saying it's her fault, but she came on just before the pandemic. And she's been working very hard to get these teams so they serve the principal and serve the goals of the district. And that's been a very heavy lift. So that was done during the school day. They were developing the teams. We had professional development. We created common planning times. And these folks get together, and their whole role was to design themselves as a team and understand what their goals are, what their purpose is. Because we had to get principals to stop just addressing problems. Oftentimes we'd have these goals and principals got to their level because they're good problem solvers. But if it came to something like attendance and we said solve the attendance problems, well, going back to the whack-a-mole example, would do well for that year, but then the next year we might have new initiatives and new targets, and then suddenly attendance would fall by the wayside. So it was really important that we developed not only the capacity of the principal, him or herself, but also the capacity of the team, and that the team understands that as they're solving these issues and addressing these issues, that it has to be a systemic, sustainable solution. And I have to say that was a huge adaptive change for principals that we still have to work on sometimes to push them back to the teams to solve these problems. So, and as we look at MTSS, we think of MTSS in two separate legs. One leg is the social emotional learning leg, which includes mental health, behaviors, PBIS. That's one leg of MTSS, and we've been focusing on that now for the last 2 years, and we're going into our third year now. We're now starting to develop our academic leg as well of MTSS, and that's we're just starting that huge and heavy lift. But to do that, what we found was we can't just have professional development during the school day, although most of the people that are on the social emotional learning teams and the PBIS teams, they're sometimes classroom teachers, but oftentimes they're also counselors who have a more flexible schedule. They're school psychologists, people who don't necessarily move at the sound of a bell. They can actually join a common planning time according to our schedule. That was effective, but now moving to the academic teams and to make sure that we had a way to push requirements out that are set by this by the SEL team or the PBIS team. In order to do that, we needed some kind of mechanism where teachers could be trained during the school day. So we made sure that each school had at least 3 45-minute common planning times per week for all academic teams. And we hired several stipended teacher leader positions in each building. Each building has a social emotional learning teacher leader, a teacher leader for equity, and a teacher leader for PBIS, as well as a math and English teacher leader for each grade level in the school. So these stipended positions are now our new step to, again, continue building capacity. And so we're developing a lot of the training on our expectations ourselves, and we're following a book called Schooling by Design, which is similar to Understanding by Design, but it's taking it to the new level of following it for an entire school. So we're doing a lot of work around that. And not only do we do the professional development for our teacher leaders and our principals, but we also have the Lynch Leadership Academy through Boston College, whose training actually our principals are all out today, and they're at the Lynch Leadership Academy, which is hosting an offsite training right down the road, and they train to the principals to identify equity issues, culturally responsive leadership, data-driven decision-making, and meeting facilitation. So they're developing those skills professionally by using this outside vendor. And we're also, as district leaders, using the same vendor to identify and address issues within the district, but making sure everything has one through line of what we're trying to do, and which is create and sustain the MTSS system, which then addresses the myriad of issues that we address on an annual basis. With that, we also have engaged the May Institute, as Mr. Putnam had mentioned before, where we've been working with them to actually develop our PBIS program, and we've actually done a lot of work on it. We've greatly improved our inclusion, and we've greatly reduced, frankly, the number of special education referrals. So a lot of this work that we're doing addresses not only things like attendance, but when we're addressing those issues, we actually wind up having a number of other issues that we're solving, and that wasn't necessarily with intention, but it's a nice byproduct. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to say this is not about professional development that's one-time professional development. We firmly believe that professional development needs to be ongoing, embedded in what we do, providing supports all the way through. So each week, I meet with the director of pupil personnel and the MTSS coordinator to discuss the SEL MTSS programs. We talk about what needs to happen in the buildings and the teams. Where do we need to build capacity? Do we need different resources? And we do that on a weekly basis. I also meet with the chief academic officer weekly to discuss the academic leg and how we continue to move that forward. But then we all meet together to discuss what are our long-range plans for MTSS. How does this impact our budget? What do we need to think about as we move forward in the week, the month, the quarter, or the year? And then also we're looking at 3 years down the road. Every principal has an evaluation goal that's to create an effective MTSS team in their building. So that's really helped us in terms of having a specific goal that drives, again, that through line of developing MTSS. And we utilize MTSS, as I said, to address any type of issue, whether it's social, emotional, or academics. The goal is to start using these systems to address all of our problems. So we have a professional development going on next week. Usually it would just be the principal sitting in an office with maybe the assistant principal designing what the professional development will be. Now we have building leadership teams with SEL folks as well as academic folks who get together after school because we're paying them a stipend, and they design those trainings. So this system is supposed to be robust, and it truly address all the issues that we're trying to address each year. And finally, I want to say that I periodically attend core meetings and facilitators meetings. Amber's at each one of the SEL meetings, and where the goal is to start weaning support from the district. So we're not doing it as often. We do alternate, so every principal meets with either me, the chief academic officer, or the pupil personnel director every week. So, and we're talking about the MTSS SEL teams, and we're also talking about the academic teams, what the principal needs and how we can support the principal and the school in terms of the development of these teams. And finally, the district coordinator meets with our MTSS SEL facilitators and PBIS coaches every month. So all those teacher leaders who are getting that extra stipend, she's able to meet with them every month to discuss their goals. So with that, I'll turn things over to Amber Casavan to continue the presentation.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure why my video is not popping up. But okay. So why did we focus on attendance right away for our MTSS teams? So really, what was the problem? So kind of pre-pandemic, our data for Gardner, as compared to the Massachusetts state average, was definitely higher. So our absences were higher. Our chronically absenteeism rates were higher with a 19%. So we knew that this was definitely a problem for us, even without the specific challenges that we faced during the pandemic. Some of our attendance challenges included defining attendance. So, as Bob mentioned earlier, it was really difficult when schools were going into the virtual remote setting where they were defining, recording, and it just looked different. Students weren't just, present or absent anymore. What did it look like in these different settings? So throughout our district, different schools were defining and recording differently. Staff within a school were also defining and recording differently. So we definitely had issues across defining attendance. Our data source, which we used Redicur, was very cumbersome to pull attendance reports. So when we started to look at this, to kind of see how big of a problem we were facing, we quickly realized that to be able to make effective database decision making, we needed to make some changes. We were not able to view graphs for visual analysis. We were pretty much looking at raw data. We, in general, were kind of functioning as a district of schools versus a school district. So each of our schools were kind of doing their own thing in regards to monitoring attendance. We did not have a consistent cycle of data review. We did not have a any consistent data points or disaggregated data that we looked at. We didn't go by any specific guiding questions, and data was really difficult to visually analyze. Again, it was not in graph form. So kind of looking at our interventions, what were we doing at this time? So prior to focusing on attendance through MTSS, our interventions were very tier 2 and tier 3 focused. So responses were definitely required. We had, kind of across the district, a laundry list of interventions. Basically, we were kind of doing everything we could and throwing in the kitchen sink as well. So what did it look like, right? So these were our problems. Now we began to decide, okay, we're going to focus on attendance. We're going to, funnel this through MTSS. So what did this look like? Since we were really building our MTSS, so we were kind of building the plane as we're flying it. People that know me know that I say that a lot. But really what we had to do is we found that pre-correcting and lots of modeling, lots of coaching for school teams were really critical to success. We adapted a behavioral skills training model where we basically, as Mark mentioned, we're training, training trainers and training, teacher leaders to train teams. And it's this kind of pyramidal approach, where we provided descriptions, both verbal and written. We demonstrated and modeled these target skills through district MTSS meetings, through MTSS facilitator meetings, in our district PBIS coaches meetings, and in our mental health staff meetings. So we would, kind of go over, some of these, scripts and tools and outlines of what we wanted our facilitators, what we wanted our teacher leaders to be doing in these meetings, both facilitative and following the MTSS process. So then we would demonstrate and model those skills, and then we'd provide them time to practice it. So it was really important, to provide time at a district level to kind of pull all the facilitators together after modeling, and then give them time to kind of work through it, both, for our facilitators and through our mental health staff team meetings as well. And then, being a district initiative, that this is, something that we're doing in every single building, every building, every facilitator is bringing this back to their own meetings. And then, myself as a coordinator and, our people personnel director and superintendent, we would have opportunities to observe meetings and then debrief after the meetings and provide feedback. So some of our implementation conditions for success, so thinking about, okay, well, what made this successful throughout doing this? Mark talked a lot about our district leadership involvement. So through our superintendent's commitment, our pupil personnel director's commitment and direction. Without their commitment alone, my role wouldn't even exist. And then, kind of coming in as a coordinator coach, beginning to focus on coaching plans and feedback and looking at this, behavioral skills training model. We've also participated in the MTSS SEL Mental Health Academy, the DESI's. We have a district team that participates in that. With this district team, we're very conscious of our representation. So this team is kind of the team that drives our district system processes. So we have membership from every building. We have membership across roles. So we have administrators, we have counselors, we have school psychologists, BCBAs, we have special ed administrators. So kind of across the board, we have representation, and we have school representation as well. So when something comes up, or something that needs to be problem solved, or something that needs to be created, or a process that needs to be kind of rolled out to the district, this is the team that it goes through. Other systems of success, we've had a number of grants that have been approved and helpful to support this work. We've had technical assistance from the May Institute. And one thing that was really key, I think, personally, is phasing in each building's participation. So we didn't, decide one day, okay, this year we're gonna, implement MTSS in every building, from day one. We started with one building and we kind of worked out some of the kinks. Then we phased in a second building. And then that following year, we phased in the rest of the buildings. We also did this similarly with the tiers. So we kind of focused at tier 1. And then once every building was, actively, participating in their meetings and conducting their meetings and building up their fidelity of tier 1 implementation, then we would begin phasing in tier 2. We created a number of tools, kind of like technical scripts and tools to support our team's work for consistency. So we developed a manual. And we've also been giving lots of facilitator support. So, not just in the areas of, MTSS, methodology and the framework, but also in, technical, adaptive, and facilitative leadership skills as well. And we've also been focusing on, results, process, and relationships within our meetings, really making sure that, we are outlining with consistent agendas, what our purpose of our meeting is, what our meeting outcomes are going to be, what activities we plan to get to those outcomes, and how we're building relationships and trust. So kind of getting into what our MTSS and PBIS implementation processes look like. So we really focused on the 4-step database decision-making process. So really focusing on, defining what the problem is, analyzing, identify and analyze, implement, and evaluate. So this is kind of a timeline of what this looked like specifically for our attendance. So we worked with teams walking through this process, this 4-step process, to address attendance. So in kind of looking at last year during the pandemic, so our 2021 school year, in October, November, one of our early adopter elementary schools started to look at defining attendance. And then we created a more efficient data source so that we could actually disaggregate the data and view it with visual analysis. Then we began identifying data points and guiding questions to use to analyze that data more efficiently. Then we moved into kind of December, January. From that, we created problem statements. I think Bob gave an example earlier on. Then we identified decision-making criteria. So, okay, it's great that, now we've identified the problem, but is this a tier 1 issue? Is this tier 2 or tier 3? Then February and March, we started turning those problem statements into outcome goals, prioritizing those outcome goals and interventions based on key levers. So, sometimes we might have had more than one problem, and how would we go about addressing that, and what interventions or what outcome goals would affect the most students, requiring kind of the least amount of additional resources. Then we identified progress monitoring tools for those interventions, and finally fidelity measures. Then kind of wrapping up the school year last year, we really kind of focused on those student outcomes. So is this effective? We were continuously evaluating our systems, our practices, our data, our process. Getting into kind of our data source, the May Institute, kind of challenged us with a data representation challenge. As mentioned before, initially we were only able to look at attendance by whole school, and it was not disaggregated. So, challenge accepted. We were then able to look at our data by classroom, by staff, what percentage of students were chronically absent, by grade, by IEP status, by race, ethnicities, groups, as well as day of the week. And we were able to look at individual student trend graphs as well that came out of some of that work later. So this is kind of an example of what our graphs ended up looking like. So again, by month, by grade, by day of the week, that was the line graph. By IEP status. So we had a number of different bar graphs. And the way we kind of came to this, you know, our early adopter elementary school has a assistant principal who is, you know, really key in Excel spreadsheets. But we also pulled in, you know, a few counselors across the district that were really familiar with our attendance database, as well as myself, and as well as Joyce West, the director of pupil personnel, kind of getting that kind of big district. What do we need to know? What questions do we need to ask? So kind of behind the scenes, after we developed that data source, we had kind of a unofficial internal data challenge. You know, we came out with this really great data tool. We rolled it out. We were able to look at attendance, you know, visually across every building in our district. And then, you know, other schools started to, you know, add to this. So now this is still a work in progress because it hasn't been rolled out across the whole district yet. But our middle school started to look at individual student trends, beginning to progress monitor and flag students for tier 2 and tier 3. We've also, our district team has also started working on triangulating instead of just looking at our attendance alone, which is important to do to make database decision making specific to attendance, but also when prioritizing, you know, groups of students and prioritizing the work, also being able to look at it across other data sources. So academic, you know, mental health screeners, which we use the BEST screener. And then as well as, you know, discipline indicators, looking at, you know, our office discipline referrals, and then being able to kind of flag students, you know, across multiple data sources. Again, this is a work in progress, and it's something that, you know, we're beginning to kind of form, but hasn't been rolled out to all schools as of yet. So something that we've circled back to quite a bit is, you know, to make a switch, you need to script the critical moves. So Chip Heath in his book, you know, the switch, how to change things when change is hard. We've come back to, you know, some of the technical pieces of, you know, okay, we need, you know, guiding questions, we need tools, we need manuals, we need processes that are written that are district-wide for consistency. But also just to help, you know, the teams really build their habits and build their routine. This is very new to them, and it's, you know, quite frankly, a culture shift for many of our schools to be working in teams that maybe had never sat down at a table together before, and using this new database decision-making process that is different than the process that they, you know, that kind of whack-a-mole from the principal down, you know, that Mark described earlier. So we provided instructions. We developed tools and scripts to reference guiding questions that corresponded to our data points that we were looking at. And we reviewed that tool at district level MTSS meetings to make sure that all of our teams are building shared understanding. We modeled the guiding questions that were reviewed. And again, it was a district initiative, you know, for all teams to follow. And then we were able to provide feedback to facilitators, coaches, and mental health staff. So some of those tools included a 4-step database decision-making checklist. We found that it wasn't enough to just kind of simply show the picture of the 4-step database decision-making process and expect teams to follow it. Often, you know, what we were running into is that they could do it kind of once, but they were having difficulty replicating that across, you know, either other data sources or the next month, and needing a lot of explicit feedback for next steps. So we found that by kind of giving them a checklist that they could walk through for any data source, and every time they look at attendance, it really allowed them to be able to kind of be more independent with going through those steps. And again, to work on that, building that habit and routine. This is the way we do it. Another tool another script tool that we developed was our MTSS data analysis guiding questions. So we found that even with data disaggregated, teams had difficulty asking the right questions. So this really provided teams a script for key queries, data points to ask and consider when reviewing and analyzing data. Teams were getting stuck on Fidelity as well. So one of their other tools was a Fidelity checklist. So kind of working through the components of, key intervention pieces. Not all curriculum comes with a fancy Fidelity tool, we know that. And our teams and members on our teams really had varying levels of understanding related to Fidelity. So we really wanted an easy way to break down key components of an intervention in a way that could measure fidelity for any intervention. So some of the guiding questions specific to attendance, it was, kind of what is the average attendance rate for the whole school by month? What percentage of students are chronically absent? What's the average attendance rate by grade, IEP status, race, ethnicity, our English language learner group, day of the week, and classroom or course or groups of staff as well. So we thought that was great and that teams would be, kind of set to go. But then we quickly figured out that it wasn't enough to just give these kind of general guiding questions, that even though they were answering the questions, often didn't necessarily know that next step of what to do with even the answers to those questions. So we found that, providing some additional follow-up scripted questions of, okay, when you're looking at average attendance rate for the whole school by month, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is there no change? When you're looking at your percentage of students that are chronically absent, what percentage have 5 versus 10? And when looking at, your average attendance rates by grade, what grades have the lowest attendance? Are those increasing, decreasing, or no change? So really additional follow-up questions to guide teams to better identify trends and patterns with their data. So from all of that data analysis, we followed that kind of same behavioral skills training process, and we trained teams in creating problem statements. So we practiced this at district level facilitator meetings. We had every team bring their, answer the guiding questions from, the month prior, and we, had them really create these problem statements following some examples. So again, this is a problem statement from one of our early adopter schools. That, clearly attendance was an issue because we had 45% of our students, had more than 5 absences. Grade 3 being our lowest attendance rate. Wednesdays, which was our virtual remote day, was also a problem area for that school. So this led to kind of our road to resource mapping. So now, that we've defined the problem, we've looked at the data, we've created our problem statements, then we started to kind of prioritize, turning our problem statements into outcome goals and prioritizing them for intervention. We had been acting from that very reactive tier 2, tier 3 intervention. So we found it was really helpful to kind of zoom out and look at, okay, well, what are we already doing? And how would we categorize our interventions between tier 1 for all students, tier 2, and tier 3? And then once we had kind of, resource mapped across the tiers, then we started looking at, what are the key elements that we need in an intervention? What is the intervention? Is it evidence-based? What does the intervention target? What area of student need or function does this intervention address? What is the Fidelity tool? And what data would be used to evaluate student outcome in progress, effectiveness of the intervention? So kind of through this whole process, we found, a few things. So one, the majority of our interventions were tier 2, tier 3 based, and teams were really getting tripped up around Fidelity. If the intervention didn't come with a tool, kind of what next? So this led to our district Fidelity tool that we created to help guide teams in kind of answering questions. Are we doing what we said we were going to do, and what does this look like? So kind of taking our outcome goal, identifying the intervention, and then really identifying the key elements of that intervention that really make it effective. So measuring fidelity, assessing effectiveness, and with the goal of improving efficiency. Nobody has any extra time. especially, during a pandemic, when, there's, a myriad of problems. But, we had been kind of throwing everything at it, and we really wanted, our goal was to get more efficient, more effective, and essentially kind of what, the other superintendent said earlier, as well as that, it's really important to be strategic and to do less. So what were the magic interventions? We really emphasize universal interventions. So tier 1 for all students, focusing on, our systems to address all students. So it was more of not a specific intervention per se, but a shift in culture, a shift in thinking from that reactive to preventative. We emphasize universal interventions both school-wide and class-wide. We had grade level dojo points, grade level attendance. We had school stores on our remote days to increase attendance on those days. We added expectations and acknowledgement points for being here, being engaged. We focused on improving engagement and on-task behavior in the classroom. We also had teachers focusing on greeting students at the door or at the threshold of the building. And our early elementary schools also really focused on parent outreach, because often it's more so the parent that can't get the student there, when they're in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, than it is the student. So again, kind of looking at emphasizing our universal interventions, we focused on implementation fidelity for tier 1, and we saw huge increases. Our early adopter Elm Street School had over a 20% increase in fidelity of tier 1 as measured by the tiered fidelity inventory. And our other elementary school boosted their fidelity up over 80%. We focused on our acknowledgement systems. So again, we added those expectations, acknowledgement points for being here, being engaged. And we really focused on the importance of this because it was something that we could do for all students, whether they were in person in front of us or virtually. We shifted to dojo points from paper tickets. And we saw, our early adopter school by the end of the year had over 142,000 dojo points awarded to students, averaging 320 per student. And our other elementary school had significant increases month to month on an increasing trend throughout the year as well. So kind of getting ready to return to full in-person last spring and April, and again this fall. We definitely anticipated increased anxiety and school refusal. So we continued to focus on our universal interventions and what we could do for all students. We had red carpet return with balloons and banners and music. We previewed videos of expectations ahead of time. So this is all well and good, and these are all great things to do, but what were the results? Our early adopter saw huge success. I mean, an increasing trend back in October, as soon as we started really looking at defining attendance and disaggregating the data and being able to share it with all staff. We immediately saw an improvement, and then the rest of the steps that followed really continued the sustainability of that success. So while all of our schools across the district, we're being phased in, we're focusing at different points along the way, we didn't necessarily see this exact same level of success from all schools at the same time. But what we did see was that when kind of all schools were catching up with the rollout of this data source and the way that we were disaggregating and asking guiding questions, was that every school from January to February saw an increase in attendance. And when we broke this down by what this meant in regards to instructional minutes gained, just from January to February alone, district-wide, we saw an increase of 355,870 instructional minutes gained for that month alone. And these are a few graphs from other schools across the district for attendance as well that also saw, continued increasing trends or an increase with some stabilization as well. So what have we learned and what's next for us? Because, as Mark said, this isn't about focusing on attendance for 1 year, but how do we make this sustainable and how do we continue the work? So we have learned through this that we need to focus on equity gaps and disproportionality. We need to focus on improving Tier 1 practices at our secondary level and focus on improving fidelity of practices across the district. We need to focus on the disproportionality around IEP status. So students with disabilities have lower attendance across our district as compared to students without disabilities. And our students in the Latino self-disclosed group have lower attendance across the district as compared to other race ethnicity self-disclosed groups as well. We are, again, focusing on improving our PBIS framework across the district at our secondary level. So this is kind of a preview of what's to come from our middle school and our high school. So, what does this look like, for a high school level? They have done a fantastic job of getting this started. This is their first year of implementing PBIS at the high school level. And what does this look like at Gardner High School? So we are focusing on fidelity and, really honing in on being efficient and effective. Focusing on, are we doing what we said we were going to do, and what are those key elements that we need to ensure are effective, the critical defining features of the interventions that we're doing. So that is everything that I had. If there's any questions.
This is Joyce. I'm just checking for the poll right now. I would just ask that any attendees, if you have any questions, please place them in the poll section.
While we're waiting for those questions, the other, Amber talked a lot about Tier 1, which has made a huge difference, but also at Tier 2 is the counselors set up small groups for those students at risk of attendance to focus on, how can they better get to school in terms of problem solving, and broke that down by function in terms of what the issues might be in terms of those particular students. They looked at in terms of their Tier 2 interventions, and when they did resource mapping and came up with a standardized protocol for students that would be at 5 or more, who were just beginning to move into attendance issues, and had all the mental health folks and counselors to be able to follow that standardized protocol of evidence-based practices. So rather than each person doing their own thing, that there was a standard protocol for folks to be able to do that. And then for those students who really weren't responsive to those either small group interventions or standard protocol interventions, they also developed their Tier 3 interventions in terms of how would be the best way to reach out to families or to students. And in some cases, the younger student wasn't coming to school and the older student was. So how do we reach out potentially to the older student to see if they can facilitate? The other thing they really tried to do is link up all the students with who their special person was in school. So if it was the custodian, is how do we make that link between the custodian and the family at Tier 3, or who was that special person in school that would be able to bring that that student, develop the relationship. So it would be important in terms of connecting with that. So they spent a lot of time in terms of developing those relationships. And when you look at the PowerPoints, the dojo, the focus was on really developing the relationship. Amber, oftentimes the letter went out when the student was involved in attendance problems, and they developed ways to reach out, suggested the teachers reach out and connect with the families, or to see whether to have that more special relationship, whether we could foster that as well. So there was a lot of things that Amber could have gone on for another half hour, but we told her she only had X amount of time, and Mark could have gone on for
Speaking of which, Bob, there are a number of questions in the poll that I think, and most of them are for Amber.
Okay.
So, one of the first things I see is, people are asking for the Excel spreadsheets. Is there any way we can make them, make that available to folks? People are asking for the Excel spreadsheets, and there was one person who asked for the attendance behavior skills training module.
Okay, so regarding kind of a training module, we didn't use kind of like a specific like training PowerPoint. We just kind of followed that model of, basically, providing verbal and written instructions of what it is that we wanted our teams to be doing, then modeling, practice and role play, and providing feedback. So just kind of having that, I am a BCBA, so having that behavioral background, is helpful, and just kind of helping to shape some of the training, kind of following that model. And then in regards to the spreadsheets, there should be a few tools in our files for some of the key tools that we did use.
Please go ahead. I'm on a conference call.
So, the 4-step database decision-making checklist, our Fidelity checklist are some of the tools that we have uploaded, for participants to be able to download. The specific Excel spreadsheets are very specific to our data source, being Redeker. But it's definitely, if somebody ever, had interest in what types of things went into that, I'd be, happy to follow up. I think my information is at the end of these slides as well. But they're not specific like templates that are universal. They're very specific to our data source.
Okay. Have you begun the work for addressing tier 1 strategies at the secondary level? And on another note, how far along, and there was a question about specifically at the middle school, how far along are you in developing those tier 1 strategies?
So the answer is yes, we have. So our middle school, kind of had PBIS in the past, and then kind of faded back a little bit. It wasn't as prominent across their day-to-day school. So it was kind of in the background. And this year and last year, we really have been focusing on kind of bringing it back and really focused on getting it in every classroom for all students every day. And so they are, they have their building-wide expectations and their acknowledgement system, and they are now kind of moving into that next step of kind of really defining their behaviors and really focusing on, their office discipline referral database as well. But they do have a lot of those key elements. It's kind of looking at the fidelity of implementation at this point. And then our high school, this is their first year. And although their goal was kind of to take the year to really build their expectations, they have moved very quickly, and they found that they actually had a lot of PBIS components, even though they weren't calling it PBIS. So they had acknowledgement systems already. They had kind of this overview of kind of their building expectations. And so it was really just a matter of kind of taking the things that they were already doing and connecting them and organizing it in a way that connected and reinforced those tier 1 behaviors.
All right, I'm just going to jump in here. There are a few questions in terms of teachers, and how are your teachers included in your varying levels of the data meetings? For example, like looking at data meeting protocols, expectations to use data to inform instruction, and reporting back.
So one of the things our district team did kind of through our MTSS manual is we identified core membership for our MTSS team. So every tier 1 MTSS team, it was a district requirement to have a regular ed teacher on that team. And so core membership was a key part of that. And it's, difficult obviously to have them on every team across the day, but at least, once a month having, teacher representative at that meeting was really important. So that's for kind of our MTSS meetings, but then we also have PBIS meetings that meet, either during the school day, after school, before school, and we have a number of teacher representatives on those teams as well. So even if our teachers aren't able to sit on every tier of the MTSS, we have at least one on our tier 1, and then we have teacher representation on our PBIS teams as well. And then, through that, both of those teams follow that database decision-making process.
Can you speak a little bit to what the stipend piece looks like in terms of, teachers teaching a full load? Where does the work happen for the stipend amount?
So the way we figured that out was we put together, we figured out it would take about 2.5 hours per week of additional work time during the school year. And so we just averaged that together and we came out with $2,500 for the position. So that is inclusive of after school meetings, because every other week they have an after school meeting called a BLT, because everybody loves BLTs. It's the building leadership team meets, and that's the teacher leaders. So yes, they're teaching a full load. The stipend is 2.5 hours per week over and above, and that's an average. So some weeks it might be 4 hours, some weeks it might be 0 hours. It really depends on the week. And our goal is to help them to prepare to facilitate their team meetings at the academic level, or to facilitate the SEL meetings. So those stipends have worked wonders in terms of, again, using a distributed leadership model where we're spreading out the work. Many hands make light work. That's the way we think.
Okay, just checking. We answered a few here. Maybe you can speak to a little bit of how we've integrated our systems, looking at PBIS, our mental health, MTSS. What that look like for Gardner?
So when I, kind of first came on board and, kind of looking at, kind of the district vision of kind of, kind of coordinating our PBIS efforts that were already in place, and how do we shift that into a more integrated MTSS model? And it was, we worked with our PBIS existing teams, and then we kind of really through that core membership of looking at, okay, our PBIS teams were volunteer, right? So they're meeting before and after school, it's volunteer. We have these teams over here. We had identified common planning times for our mental health staff. And then we really wanted a way to kind of bring it all together. So we had our PBIS coaches on as core membership for our MTSS team. We also had counselors, school psych, behavior analysts, administrators, all also as core members. And so a way of kind of integrating those efforts and not siloing, our PBIS, social, emotional, behavior efforts over here and our mental health efforts over here, and then our, building leadership teams over here. We really found a way through MTSS to kind of bring all those core membership pieces together and begin to have the conversations at a table, really integrating those efforts so that we're all focusing on the same things. And
right
not
now the building leadership team has not the PBIS coordinator, the teacher leaders, the equity teacher leaders, and the SEL teacher leaders, all with the academic teacher leaders after school, and they're the ones that really identify the needs for professional development of the building or what the next steps are for the building, and they create that professional development. So it's all together. We were very conscious of starting this whole process though with SEL because we believe that it's really important for kids to be available to learn before we can they're going to learn anything. So that's why we really focused on SEL first. So SEL is a little further along than the academic teams, but now there is definitely an interwoven system where if SEL has a tier 1 practice that needs to go out to everyone, we can do professional development with all teachers throughout the entire building, really in a week's time.
Okay.
We have a presentation tomorrow in the mental health integration strand. So if you want more information, please join us.
We've just got about 1 or 2 minutes, so maybe you can speak a little bit to now the attendance, looking at the attendance at the building levels. How can that transition to district-wide, and what's that going to look like moving forward?
Sure. So now that we have some consistent data sources and guiding questions and data points to look at across the district, and each building are looking at the same thing essentially. Now, kind of our next step is to kind of take that summary data. We've worked on creating annual reports at the end of last year, kind of bringing in all of each building's information and summary of their patterns and trends into kind of one report, and then kind of from there, we're able to kind of zoom out in our district level meetings and begin looking at patterns and trends across the district. So are we seeing, every year, in October, November, do we have, is that where our, attendance tends to decrease? Looking at, kind of district-wide trends. And really that's what led us to begin to see, that, our students with disabilities versus students without disabilities, was a disproportionality for us, as well as, our Latino self-disclosed racial groups as well. We're able to now see, okay, this is a district trend. This is a district problem, and how can we address it from a district level instead of hyper-focusing on each individual building.
Okay. All right. Looks like time is up on this session. I don't see anything else. And Amber, you did say, as far as reaching out, a few people may have some questions. Contact information is listed, I believe.
I think it might be on maybe one of the beginning slides when Bob was kind of introducing everybody. I believe our emails are right on there, so you can use that email. That's my Gardner email.
Great. I do think a few people have questions on specific slides or tools. Okay.
And then the tools you should be able to find them in the tools section of the Pathways platform as well. Great.
And just a reminder to fill out the evaluation for this session. And that would be on the actual session pathable form. So we would love you to provide us feedback. So let us know what we've done well, what other things we can do to make this session more beneficial to you. So. Thanks all. Thanks to the great team from Gardner. They've done a really impressive job. It's continuing to be a work in progress. And again, we have some of these folks will be presenting the integration of mental health and on classroom behavior support practices. How do you take high leverage classroom practices and move that to the district level? So thanks very much for your participation. Bye-bye.